People imagine knights as heroes in shining armor, mounted warriors in gleaming steel, riding into glory beneath flying banners. But in 1200, the truth was far harsher. A knight did not wake to glory. He woke to freezing stone, aching muscles, stale straw, and the knowledge that survival came before honor. His armor was not shining. It was heavy, oiled against rust, and painful to wear for hours. His food was plain. His bed was hard. His future was uncertain. And the castle around him was not a palace. It was a workplace, a garrison, and a cage, all built from the same grey stone. From the moment he woke before dawn to the moment he collapsed onto a straw mattress long after dark, this was the brutal reality of a knight's life in 1200. We are going to follow him through every hour. We will feel the cold of his chamber, the weight of his armor, the impact of training, the dullness of his meals, the silence of the wall walk at midnight, and the fear that lived behind every duty. And by midnight, you will understand why survival mattered more than glory. This is not knighthood as legend, it is knighthood as survival. The knight woke in darkness, not the soft darkness of a curtained bedroom, the deep, unbroken darkness of a stone room with no glass in the windows and no fire left in the hearth. The shutters were closed against the wind. The air inside was cold enough to see breath, if there had been any light to see it by. His bed was little more than a straw mattress, damp, unchanged for weeks, heavy with sweat and cold. The smell of old straw never truly left the room. A single wool blanket, perhaps a second if the season was harsh, no pillow, or a rough one stuffed flat long ago. He shared the room. Other knights slept around him, in the same chamber, in a corner of the great hall, in a room above the gatehouse or beside the armory. The sounds of other men breathing, shifting, coughing, and muttering in their sleep filled every night. Privacy did not exist. And before sunrise, duty had already begun. When the chapel bell rang, or when a servant knocked, or when habit simply pulled him from sleep, he rose. The floor was stone, cold stone, enough to make a man flinch before the day had even started. He reached for his boots in the dark, pulling them on over hose that had been slept in because the room was too cold to undress fully. There was water somewhere, a basin, a jug, carried up from the well the night before. By morning it was cold, not cool, cold. He splashed his face, wiped his hands on a rough cloth, and that was the extent of his morning hygiene. No mirror, no soap, no warm towel, no time for comfort. He pulled on a linen shirt, over that a wool tunic, belt, knife. He was not yet dressed for duty. The armor would come later, but even his ordinary clothing was heavier, rougher, and less comfortable than anything a modern person wears casually. Then came prayer. Walked through the cold corridor toward the chapel, a small stone room, a cross, an altar, candles, a chaplain whose voice filled the space with Latin that most knights understood only partially. He knelt on stone. He bowed his head. He repeated words he had been taught since boyhood. The prayer was brief, not because faith was unimportant, but because the day ahead did not wait. After chapel he might eat something, a piece of bread, a cup of weak ale, perhaps a bowl of thin pottage, if the kitchen had prepared it early enough. This was not breakfast, it was fuel, enough to keep the body moving until the main meal later in the day. The castle was already alive around him. Servants carried water across the courtyard. Smoke rose from the kitchen. A groom led a horse to the trough. A guard on the wall walk stamped his feet against the cold. The steward crossed the yard with purpose, already counting, already planning. And the knight stood somewhere in that machine. finishing his bread, flexing stiff fingers, knowing exactly what came next. The arming. This was the part of a knight's day that modern people romanticize most. The arming, the gleaming steel, the ritual transformation from man to warrior. The reality was slower, heavier, and far less glamorous. A knight in 1200 did not wear full plate armor. That belonged to a later century. What he wore was built in layers, each one adding weight, restriction, and heat, or in winter, a different kind of cold that seeped through metal and padding alike. The first layer was the gambeson. A gambeson was a padded garment made of layers of linen or wool, stitched and quilted together into a thick, heavy jacket that covered the torso and upper arms. It was the foundation of everything that came after. Without it, the mail above would chafe, bruise, and cut into skin. With it, the knight was already carrying several pounds of dense fabric before a single ring of metal had been placed on his body. The gambeson smelled. It absorbed sweat during training and combat, and it was not washed often, partly because washing broke down the padding, and partly because a working knight did not have time or facilities for regular laundry. The smell of a well-used gambeson was something between old sweat, wool grease, and the faint sourness of fabric that had never fully dried. He pulled it on over his tunic, laced it, adjusted it across the shoulders. Then came the mail. A hauberk of chainmail, thousands of interlocking iron rings riveted or welded shut, forming a heavy shirt that hung from the shoulders to below the knees, with sleeves reaching to the wrists, and often an attached coif that covered the head and neck. The weight was significant. A full mail hauberk weighed roughly 20 to 30 pounds, and unlike modern weight distributed in a backpack or across the body with straps, the mail hung almost entirely from the shoulders. After an hour, the shoulders ached. After 2 hours, the ache turned to burning. After a full day, the knight's upper body felt as though it had been pressed slowly into the ground. He could not put on the hauberk alone. Another man helped. A squire, if he had one. Another knight, if he did not. The mail was lifted overhead and guided down over the gambeson. The arms were fed through. The weight settled. The belt was cinched to transfer some of the load from shoulders to hips. A leather sword belt went over the mail, and the sword was hung at the left side. The sword itself was not ornamental. It was a working tool, heavy, sharp, balanced for use from horseback or on foot. The blade was kept oiled to prevent rust. The grip was wrapped in leather. The pommel was plain iron or steel. A knight's sword in 1200 was not a treasure. It was a necessity, carried every day, maintained every evening, and understood as the difference between living through a fight and dying in one. Over the mail, a surcoat might be worn, a cloth garment that protected the metal from rain and sun, and displayed the knight's lord's colours or his own heraldic identity. Heraldry was still developing in 1200, but the surcoat was already becoming a practical and visible part of a knight's equipment. Then came the rest, mail chausses covering the legs, heavy, tied to the belt beneath the hauberk, a coif over the head and neck, framing the face in iron rings, gauntlets of leather or mail protecting the hands, a helmet, in 1200, most commonly a flat-topped great helm or a simpler nasal helm with a bar protecting the nose. The helmet restricted vision, muffled hearing, and made breathing harder. It was essential and miserable in equal measure, and boots, heavy leather boots built for rough terrain, not for comfort. By the time the arming was complete, the knight carried between 40 and 60 pounds of equipment on his body. He could move, he could fight, he could mount a horse, but every movement cost more effort than it would have cost without the armor, and the effort accumulated throughout the day like a debt the body could never quite repay. He was not gleaming. The mail was oiled, not polished. The gambeson was stained. The boots were scuffed. The helmet had dents from previous use. He looked like what he was, a working soldier in a working castle, prepared for a day that would test his body from the first step to the last. A squire, if present, followed him. A boy or young man in training carrying the shield, the lance if needed, and whatever else the knight required. The squire's own day was equally hard, carrying, cleaning, polishing, running and watching, always watching, because everything the knight did was a lesson the squire would one day need to repeat. The knight walked out of the arming room and into the courtyard. The training yard waited. The courtyard of a medieval castle in 1200 was not a parade ground. It was a workspace, mud in wet weather, dust in dry, horse dung near the stables, the smell of the forge, the sound of hammers, hooves and voices, dogs moving between buildings, servants crossing with buckets and bundles, and in one area, sometimes a cleared section of the bailey, sometimes a space near the curtain wall, the training ground. This was where a knight earned his keep. A household knight was not paid to sit in the great hall and look impressive. He was retained because he could fight, and fighting was a skill that degraded without constant practice. A sword arm that rested for a week lost speed. A body that avoided the saddle lost its sense of the horse. A shield hand that stopped drilling lost its instinct for the angle that would save a life. So they trained, every day. That allowed it, in cold, in rain, in the heavy, grinding heat of full armor under a summer sun that turned the mail into a furnace. The training began with the sword. Two knights faced each other in the yard, wooden training swords at first, blunted, heavier than real blades designed to build strength and punish mistakes without killing. The strikes came fast, overhead, diagonal, thrust. The sound of wood on wood echoed off the stone walls. When a blow landed on the body, it hurt. The gambeson absorbed some of the impact, but not all. Bruises accumulated, fingers swelled, wrists ached from absorbing shock after shock after shock. After sword work, the shield. A knight's shield in 1200 was kite-shaped or beginning to transition to the shorter heater shape. Large enough to cover the torso and upper leg, heavy enough to be a burden after 15 minutes of active use. Training with the shield meant absorbing impacts. It meant holding a defensive position while another man hammered at the surface. It meant learning to redirect force rather than resist it, because resistance alone would exhaust the arm in minutes. The training was not gentle. Knights did not pull their strikes in practice. A training yard in 1200 was a place where men were regularly bruised, cut, and occasionally injured seriously enough to miss days of duty. Broken fingers, split lips, cracked ribs from a blow that landed wrong. The line between practice and combat was thinner than most people imagine, because the whole point of training was to make combat feel like practice. Then came the horse. Riding was not a leisure activity for a knight, it was the foundation of his military identity. A mounted knight was the most powerful individual weapon on a medieval battlefield, and his value depended entirely on his ability to control a war horse in the chaos of combat, while wearing heavy armor and carrying weapons. The war horse itself was not a docile animal. It was bred for size, strength, and aggression. It was trained to charge, to push through resistance, to tolerate noise, impact, and confusion. Riding one required constant attention, pressure from the knees, weight shifts, Voice, reins used sparingly because the hands were occupied with sword, lance, or shield. In the training yard, the knight mounted and rode at targets. A quintain, a pivoting wooden arm with a shield on one end and a counterweight on the other, stood in the yard. The knight charged it with a lance, struck the shield, and tried to pass before the counterweight swung around and knocked him from the saddle. It was humiliating when it worked. It was painful when it did not. He practiced turns, stops, charges. He rode the horse close to walls and obstacles to build confidence in tight spaces. He dismounted and remounted in full armor, which required upper body strength that most modern athletes would struggle to match. After the horse, the bow. Not every knight used a bow. Many considered it beneath their station a weapon for common soldiers. But practical knights understood its value, and some trained with it. The English longbow was already emerging as a decisive weapon, and a knight who understood it from the archer's side, understood it better from the target's side. Between the formal drills, there was physical work that looked less like training and more like punishment. Running in armor, climbing stairs in armor, lifting stones, wrestling, grappling in mail, which was a skill of its own, how to throw a man wearing 40 pounds of iron, how to pin him, how to find the gaps where a dagger could reach. The training yard was loud, physical, repetitive, and exhausting. By the time it ended, and it could last 2 or 3 hours on a full training day, the knight was drenched in sweat beneath his gambeson. His muscles trembled, his fingers were stiff. His back ached from the weight of the mail, his breath came hard. He did not shower, he did not stretch on a mat, he did not drink a protein shake. He removed the heaviest layers of armor, drank water or ale, wiped his face with a cloth, and prepared for whatever came next. And what came next was rarely rest. The main meal of the day came late in the morning or around midday, and for the night it was the most substantial food he would see until supper. He ate in the great hall, not at the high table. That belonged to the lord, his family, and his closest officers. The knight sat lower on a bench at one of the long trestle tables surrounded by other household men. Knights, men-at-arms, senior servants, and clerks filled the hall in an order determined by rank, habit, and the steward's silent judgment. The food was not what modern people imagine when they think of medieval feasting. There were no feasts, not on ordinary days, no roasted swan on a silver platter, no overflowing cups of wine, no troubadour singing in the corner while knights laughed and raised their goblets. The knight's meal was plain, bread, dark bread made from rye or barley, heavier and coarser than the fine wheat loaves served at the lord's table. The bread was dense, sometimes hard, sometimes stale. It served as food and as trencher, a flat slab on which other food was placed, absorbing grease and gravy before being eaten last or given to the dogs. Pottage, a thick stew, of whatever vegetables the kitchen had available. Onions, beans, peas, cabbage, root vegetables, boiled together in a large pot over the kitchen fire, flavored with salt if there was salt, with herbs if there were herbs, with nothing if there was nothing. It was warm, it was filling, it was not memorable. Meat was rare on an ordinary day. When it appeared, it was often salted, preserved, or the tougher cuts that the Lord's table had rejected. Mutton, pork, occasionally beef, rarely fresh, rarely tender, rarely enough to satisfy a body that had spent the morning training in armor. Cheese, hard, aged, crumbling. Ale, brewed in the castle, weak enough to drink safely in quantity but strong enough to dull the edges of the afternoon. That was the meal. The knight ate with his knife and his hands. Forks did not exist in England in 1200. He tore bread, cut meat, scooped pottage with a spoon, or soaked it into the bread. He wiped his mouth on his sleeve or a cloth. The table was crowded. Elbows touched. Dogs moved beneath the benches, waiting for scraps. The hall was smoky. Rushes on the floor smelled of old food and damp. The fireplace gave heat to one end of the room and left the other cold. Light came from narrow windows and from torches that made the smoke worse. No feasts, no endless glory, just enough food to keep fighting. The contrast between the Lord's table and the knight's bench was visible and constant. Better bread above, better meat above, wine above. The knight could see it from where he sat. He did not comment on it. The hierarchy was understood. It was built into the stone of the hall as firmly as it was built into the structure of feudal society. After the meal, there was no rest period as a modern worker would understand it. The afternoon brought duties, tasks assigned by the lord, the steward, or the marshal. Inspecting walls, checking stores, accompanying the lord on a ride through the estate, receiving a visitor at the gatehouse, delivering a message to a neighbouring holding, supervising the men-at-arms, reviewing weapons and equipment. A knight was not a free man in the modern sense. He was a retainer. He lived in the castle because the lord permitted it, fed because the lord provided it, and useful only as long as he served. His time was not his own. His body was not his own. His skills belonged to the man who kept him, and that man expected a return on the investment every single day. If this kind of reconstruction is something you value, subscribing to Walter Reconstructs History is the best way to make sure the next one happens. Every video takes weeks of research, writing, and production, and your subscription tells me that this work matters. If you have been watching this far, you already care about history done properly. That means a lot. Now, let us step into the duties and dangers that filled the rest of the knight's day. A knight in 1200 was not a romantic figure wandering the countryside in search of adventure. He was a soldier in service, bound by obligation, and his duties extended far beyond the training yard. The castle was his workplace, and within it, he served multiple roles. First, he was a visible extension of the Lord's authority. When the Lord held court in the Great Hall, hearing disputes, receiving tenants, administering justice, the knight stood nearby. Not as decoration, but as reinforcement. His presence reminded everyone in the room that the Lord's word was backed by armed men who could enforce it. A knight standing beside the dais was a statement: obey or deal with the consequences. When a visitor arrived at the castle, a messenger, a travelling merchant, a neighbouring lord's representative, a knight might be sent to the gatehouse to receive them. He assessed the visitor. He decided whether to admit them immediately or make them wait. He accompanied them through the courtyard and into the hall, walking beside them in a way that was partly courtesy and partly surveillance. If the lord needed to travel, to attend court, to visit another lord, to inspect his lands, the knight rode with him, not as a companion but as an escort, armed, watchful, responsible for the lord's safety on roads that were not always safe, through territories that were not always friendly. Banditry was real, ambush was real, rival lords with unresolved disputes were real. The knight's job was to ensure that none of these threats reached the man he served. Within the castle itself, the knight supervised the men-at-arms, the soldiers of lower rank who formed the garrison. He checked their weapons, he inspected their equipment, he corrected their drill. He maintained discipline, which in a crowded medieval castle with limited entertainment and abundant ale was a constant, thankless task. He also maintained his own equipment. This was not optional, and it was not delegated lightly. A knight's armor was his life. A rusted link in his mail could split under a blow that an intact link would have stopped. A sword edge that had been neglected could fail at the moment it mattered most. A strap that had worn thin could break when the shield was needed. Every evening, or whenever duty allowed, the knight sat with his equipment and worked. He oiled his mail by rolling it in a barrel of sand and vinegar to remove rust, then coating it with grease. He sharpened his sword with a whetstone, testing the edge with his thumb. He checked every strap, every buckle, every rivet on his armor and gear. He examined his horse's tack, the saddle, the bridle, the girth, because a failure in the tack at speed could be fatal. If he had a squire, the squire helped. If he did not, he did it alone. This maintenance took time. It was tedious. It was unglamorous. And it was absolutely essential, because a knight whose equipment failed in the field was not a knight for long. Between duties, the knight might have fragments of time that resembled leisure. A conversation with another knight in the courtyard, a game of dice or tables in a corner of the hall, a moment of stillness on a bench in the sun, if the weather allowed and the steward did not find another task. But true rest was rare. The castle demanded constant service, and a household knight who appeared idle risked losing his position. Idleness was not a right. It was a vulnerability. A lord who saw a knight sitting when he could be useful might begin to wonder whether that knight was worth the food, the lodging, and the space he occupied. Service was not a part of the knight's life. It was the entire structure of it. By the time the sun dropped behind the castle walls, the knight's day was far from finished. The evening meal in the hall was lighter than dinner. Bread, cheese, cold meat if there was any left, ale. The hall grew dimmer as the torches burned down and the fire settled into a steady glow. Conversations became quieter. The household began to compress into the warmth of the hall, because beyond the hall's walls, the castle at night was cold, dark, and exposed to the wind. But for the night, darkness did not mean sleep. Guard duty was one of the most essential and most dreaded parts of a household knight's life. The wall walk waited. He climbed the narrow stone stairs inside the tower, each step worn smooth by years of boots. The staircase spiraled upward in near total darkness. His hand trailed along the cold wall for guidance. At the top, the wind hit him. The battlements of a castle in 1200 were open to the sky. Crenellations, the alternating high and low sections of the parapet, offered some protection, but the wind found every gap. In winter, it cut through wool and mail alike. In autumn, rain drove sideways across the wall walk, soaking everything. Even in summer, the nights could turn cold enough to make the stone underfoot feel like ice. The knight took his position. He carried his sword, wore his mail, or at minimum a gambeson and a weapon. He might carry a spear or have one leaning against the merlon beside him. A torch burned in a bracket somewhere nearby, but its light was local and weak. It illuminated a few feet of stone and left everything beyond in darkness. His job was to watch the roads, watch the tree line, watch the fields, watch the darkness for movement, for light, for shapes that should not be there. Listen for hoofbeats, for voices, for the sound of men moving through the night. Most nights, there was nothing, and that was the hardest part. Standing on a cold wall in the dark, hour after hour, watching nothing happen, is a particular kind of endurance that most people have never experienced. The body wants to sit, the eyes want to close, the mind wants to drift. But the knight knew, every knight knew, that the one night he allowed his attention to slip might be the night something came out of the darkness that he did not see in time. A sentry who slept on watch could be punished severely. In some garrisons, the penalty was death. More commonly, it was disgrace, a stain on honor that followed a man through his career and marked him as unreliable in the eyes of every lord who heard the story. So he stayed awake. He paced the wall walk. He stamped his feet. He rubbed his hands. He watched his breath disappear into the cold air. He listened to the wind moving the banners above him and the sound of the castle settling below, a horse shifting in the stable, a door closing somewhere in the keep, a dog barking once and stopping. The hours passed slowly. Time on guard duty did not move as time moved in the training yard or the hall. It stretched, it thickened. Each minute felt longer than the last, and the temptation to believe that the world beyond the wall was empty and safe grew stronger as the night deepened. But the wall was the boundary between the castle and everything that wanted to reach it. Raiders, rival lords, scouts, thieves, enemies that might arrive not as an army but as a handful of men in the dark, testing the gate, probing the ditch, looking for the stretch of wall where the torches had burned out and the guard had stopped watching. The knight on the wall was the castle's eyes in the dark. If he failed, everyone inside was vulnerable. At some point, after 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, depending on the rotation, another man climbed the tower and took his place. The relief was physical and immediate. The knight descended the stairs, crossed the courtyard in darkness, and returned to his sleeping quarters. His bed was cold. The room was cold. His body ached from training, from duty, from standing in the wind. He pulled the blanket over himself and tried to sleep, knowing that the bell would ring again before dawn, and the entire cycle would begin again. There was no recovery day, no weekend, no leave. The routine repeated until something broke it. Campaign, a siege, an order to march, or the slow accumulation of injuries that eventually made a knight unable to continue. The wall did not care how tired he was. The wall needed watching every night. Everything described so far, the cold, the armor, the training, the food, the guard duty, was physical. And the physical burden was real. But the hardest part of a knight's life in 1200 was not the weight on his body. It was the weight on his mind. A knight lived with one certainty that never left him. The next call to arms might be his last. War in 1200 was not distant. It was not abstract. It was personal, immediate, and brutal. When a lord summoned his knights to fight, the knight did not watch the battle from a command center or study it on a screen. He rode into it. He felt it. He heard the impact of weapons on shields, the screaming of wounded men and horses, the chaos of a melee where visibility was reduced to the slit in his helmet and survival depended on instincts trained in the courtyard and tested in blood. And after the battle, if he survived, he returned to the same castle, the same hall, the same bed. He ate the same bread. He watched the same walls, and he waited for the next time. The fear was real, but it was never spoken. A knight in 1200 did not discuss fear. The culture of chivalry, still forming in this period, not yet the elaborate code it would become in later centuries, demanded courage, loyalty, and endurance. A knight who admitted fear risked being seen as weak. A knight who showed fear in front of his lord risked losing his position. A knight who broke under fear in battle risked losing everything. his reputation, his livelihood, his honor, and possibly his life at the hands of a justice system that did not distinguish between cowardice and treason. So the fear lived inside, unexpressed, managed only by routine and the company of other men who carried the same burden and understood it without words. Death was familiar. A knight who had served for any length of time had seen other men die. He had watched companions fall in training accidents, in skirmishes, in sieges. He had seen wounds that would be survivable today kill men within hours because there was no surgery, no antibiotics, no way to stop infection once it began. He knew that his own body was fragile beneath the armor. A blow to the head could end consciousness. A fall from a horse could break bones that would never heal properly. An arrow through a gap in the mail could reach the body beneath. A fever could arrive without warning and leave him too weak to stand. And in a world without medicine, weakness was the beginning of a decline that might not reverse. And beyond the fear of death, there was the pressure of honor. Honor was not a word in 1200, it was a currency. A knight's reputation determined his value. It determined whether a lord would retain him, whether other knights would trust him, whether he would receive land, marriage, advancement, or merely a place in the hall and enough food to keep serving. A single act of perceived cowardice could destroy a reputation that had taken years to build. A single failure in duty could follow a man across the kingdom, whispered from castle to castle by the network of retainers, servants, and travelling knights who carried news faster than any official messenger. The pressure to perform was constant, not just in battle but in every interaction, in the training yard where other men watched how hard he fought, in the hall where his manners, his speech, and his bearing were observed, on the wall where his vigilance was assumed, in the Lord's presence, where his loyalty was measured every day by the quality of his silence and the readiness of his service. A knight could not simply be adequate. Adequacy was invisibility, and invisibility in a castle where a lord had dozens of men competing for favor meant a slow slide toward irrelevance. Then there was loneliness. A household knight might be far from his family if he had one. Younger sons with no land often entered service in their teens and spent years in castles that were not their homes, among men who were colleagues, but not kin. Marriage came late, if it came at all, because a knight without land had little to offer a wife and her family. Children were delayed or absent. The companionship of the hall was real, but it was the companionship of men bound by obligation, not by choice. Even the bond between a knight and his lord was not friendship. It was a transaction, loyalty in exchange for sustenance, service in exchange for shelter, skill in exchange for a place in the world. The lord valued the knight as long as the knight was useful. The knight served the lord as long as the lord provided. If either side of the equation failed, the relationship ended. Every knight lived inside this understanding. Every sunrise might be his last. Every meal was earned by the work of the day before. Every night on the wall was another proof of usefulness. Every year of service was another year survived, not celebrated, not rewarded with a trophy, but simply acknowledged by the continued permission to remain. That was the psychology of knighthood in 1200. Not glory, not romance, not the shining ideal of later centuries. Survival, duty, fear, and the quiet endurance of a life that demanded everything and promised nothing beyond the next day's bread. The next time you imagine a knight, do not imagine the painting. Do not imagine the gleaming armor, the raised sword, the banner in the wind. Imagine a man standing on a cold wall at midnight, watching darkness for something that probably will not come, but might. Imagine a man pulling a stained gambeson over sore shoulders, knowing the weight of the mail will follow and knowing it will hurt. Imagine a man eating dark bread at a bench while the Lord's white loaves sit on a table he will never reach. Imagine a man kneeling in a stone chapel before dawn, asking God for one more day. That was knighthood in 1200. More survival than glory, and the castle did not care whether he was brave, afraid, exhausted, or broken. The castle only needed him ready. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy this kind of deep historical reconstruction, please subscribe to Walter Reconstructs History. I make videos that bring lost castles, vanished worlds, and decisive turning points back to life in a way that is simple, visual, and grounded in real history. And if there is another knight, king, queen, or forgotten world you want to see reconstructed next, leave it in the comments. What should I reconstruct next on Walter Reconstructs History?